Thanks for coming this evening. We're really excited about our program tonight. Before we start, if you would please turn off cell phones and pagers, that would be great. We are quite relaxed now after the nice music to the presentation here. This is one of our final Meet the Author programs in this building. We bid farewell to this building with really mixed feelings. So it'll be a memorable program. Our talk tonight is about a memoir, The Red Leather Diary, Reclaiming a Life Through the Pages of a Lost Journal. It's a story of youth, innocence, sophistication, hope, dreams, and teenage angst. I would not want my diary from when I was 14 to be published. I'm sure it wouldn't get this kind of attention. This is the milestone diary of Florence Wolfson. Was discovered in a dumpster on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, cracked and crumbling, a daily diary with faithful entries every day from 1929 to 34. Our speaker today came into possession of the diary and began a journey into the past. An investigation led to the reunion of diary and diarist, age 90, and ultimately this rich and surprising story of 5 years in the life of a young girl of privilege in New York City. It's a New York City most of us never knew or could ever imagine. And the book does more than just reproduce the diary. Our author today conducted intimate, lengthy interviews with Florence, the subject of the diary, and she grew to know this cultured, modern, open, and exciting woman. Today we have the opportunity to get to know the author of The Red Leather Diary, Reclaiming a Life Through the Pages of a Lost Journal, a writer for the New York Times and other publications. It is my pleasure to introduce Lily Koppel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Hi, it's really wonderful to be here, and I just want to take a moment to thank everybody at the Darien Library. It's really been a wonderful welcome that they've given me. The Red Leather Diary is really a fairy tale, and it's one that I entered into, and one that I hope all of you will by the end of the evening. And I'm going to begin by reading from the diary, from the book, and then telling you how I stumbled into this story. Once upon a time, the diary had a tiny key. Little red flakes now crumble off the worn cover. For more than half a century, its tarnished latch unlocked, the red leather diary lay silent inside an old steamer trunk strewn with vintage labels evoking the glamorous age of ocean liner travel. This book belongs to, reads the frontispiece, followed by Florence Wolfson scrawled in faded black ink. Inside, in brief, breathless dispatches written on gold-edged pages, the journal recorded 5 years in the life and times of a smart and headstrong New York teenager, a young woman who loved Baudelaire, Central Park, and men and women with equal abandon. Tucked within the diary, like a pressed flower, is a yellowed newspaper clipping. The photograph of a girl with huge, soulful eyes and marcelled blonde hair atop a heart-shaped face stares out of the brittle scrap. The diary was a gift for her 14th birthday on August 11th, 1929, and she wrote a few lines faithfully every day until she turned 19. Then, like so many relics of time past, it was forgotten. The trunk in turn languished in the basement of 98 Riverside Drive, a pre-war apartment house at 82nd Street, until October 2003, when the management decided it was time to clear out the storage area. The trunk was one of a roomful carted to a waiting dumpster, and is often the case in New York, trash and treasure were bedfellows. Some passers-by jimmied open the locks and pried apart the trunk's sides in search of old money. Others stared transfixed, as if gazing into a shipwreck at the treasures spilling from the warped cedar drawers: a flowered kimono, a beaded flapper dress, a cloth-bound volume of Tennyson's poems, half of a baby's red sweater still hanging from its knitting needles. A single limp silk glove fluttered like a small flag. But the diary seems a particularly eloquent survivor of another age. It was as if a corsage, once pinned to a girl's dress, were preserved for 3/4 of a century, faded ribbons intact, the scent still lingering on its petals. Through a serendipitous chain of events, the diary was given the chance to tell its story, and exactly why I'm standing here tonight. Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Chicago. I moved to New York to go to college, and I went to Barnard. And while I was there, I began writing seriously for the first time in my life. And I was working on a novel, which I was about halfway done with when I graduated. And I had this very romantic notion of what it meant to be a writer. And this was sort of a la Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which I'd read for the first time in New York. I figured I would find an apartment, somehow afford the rent, finish my novel, break into the publishing world, you know, a very easy 3-step program. Well, all of my friends were either moving to the Lower East Side or they were moving to the Left Bank, which is Brooklyn. I took a different turn, and I responded to an ad of a woman who was renting a room in her Upper West Side apartment. And the first time I came to 98 Riverside Drive, I was really sold. There was this red marble lobby, these stained glass windows. It was a elevator. The elevator was operated, you know, by the doorman, and it was paneled in wood with a little seat in the corner. And I thought, yeah, this is how I imagined my New York life to be, you know? After all, it was only a room, and it was affordable, but it really felt like the beginning of a good short story or of a Woody Allen film. So anyway, I moved in. I was living in my landlady's lavender-painted bedroom in this 4-poster white iron bed. And at first, it was really heavenly. It was like my B&B on the Upper West Side, as she had described it. I actually never knew New York could be so relaxing. It was more like Connecticut, you know, no soot on everything, and, you know, just, it was really my little nest. But after a few weeks, little things started creeping up. There was a no men allowed rule. We were, me, my landlady, her blind cat. Well, things were a little tense, as I guess it always has to be if you're living in somebody else's home. But not everything was all that bad. I had landed a job at the New York Times, and I started as a news clerk on the Metro desk, which basically meant that I was helping editors coordinate breaking news coverage, answering phones, you know, anything I could kind of help out with there, all the while trying to get my own name into the paper. And at first I had what I thought of as the death and celebrity beat. I was writing obituaries, and I was covering celebrities, and I was being dispatched almost nightly to the red carpet and interviewing the likes of Clint Eastwood about his love of transcendental meditation and gardening, to James Gandolfini, who asked me out on a date, a little item that I turned into the paper, earning me the title bravest gossip reporter ever. Shirley MacLaine tried to convince me of a past life on a 2-hour interview in this deserted hotel ballroom. But like any young person who moves to the big city, I was really searching for love and meaning in my own life, and as a writer, a good story. And this came to me in the most unusual way, which is one morning, it was October 6th, 2003, and I left 98 Riverside Drive, and parked in front of the building's awning was this rusted red dumpster. And I could see at a glance, one side was down. There were about 50 old steamer trunks, and each one was riveted in brass and plastered with its vintage travel labels from Paris and London and Monaco. One in particular was property of the Diary of Anne Frank Hotel in Amsterdam. And I just had the sensation that this was a message in a bottle, that it wasn't going to be around for long. And despite being dressed and late for work, I found myself being almost drawn magnetically towards this dumpster. And people sort of give me a strange look, as you all are now. You know, they think, well, you don't look like the type of girl who would just dive headlong into a dumpster. Well, I am, sorry, you know. And I climbed up, and all of a sudden, I'm balancing in my ballet flats about 6 trunks deep, wondering when I had my last tetanus shot, as I start excavating. And each trunk really opened like a small closet, which was meant to go in an ocean liner in somebody's cabin. And one side was fitted with drawers, and the other with hangers. And I found this flapper dress. I found this gorgeous coat from Bergdorf's, which was tangerine boucle with an iridescent silk lining and a single Bakelite button, which needed only a trip to the dry cleaner, in which I now wear. There was an entire collection of vintage handbags. There was a lucite box purse, a scaled beaded evening bag, and each one really a time capsule or a Cornell box, if you will. There were little notes written in a delicate woman's hand that said, piano-tuned, carpets down, pickup bra from Saks. There was a matchbox from Schrafft's, another from El Morocco, where people once toasted the night. There was a cigarette with just the trace of a lady's lipstick on the end, and a tube of Revlon lipstick in the shade Bachelor's Carnation. And I just got this absolute whiff of the past and of how life was lived among a certain set in the 20s and the 30s. Well, I ended up sort of time dissolved. I ended up staying in this, you know, archaeological site the entire day, and conveniently there was a street lamp located right above, so by nightfall it was illuminated, you know, like, almost like a stage set, which it felt like to me. And what emerged from this virtual urban shipwreck was this crumbling red leather diary kept by a young woman named Florence Wolfson from 1929 to 1934, between the ages of 14 and 19 years old. And you saw it up there, and this is actually Florence's first entry in the diary. It says, "This is my first entry in this beautiful diary, because today I'm 14 years old." And it was, it looked just like the cover of the book, and it was this crumbling red leather lined in old financial pages, and had this rusted brass latch, which I tested that evening when I was alone in my room after dragging my findings in, which didn't go so well with my landlady, but that was all right. And I remember these little pieces of red leather crumbling onto my bedspread as I opened it, and I was really transported into this young woman's world. There were over 2,000 entries. She never skipped a day in the diary's full 5 years. Each of the pages was edged in gold, and there was this swirling black and blue ink, which was filling each of the pale blue lines of the diary's pages. And I'm going to read to you from the diary. Its nearly 2,000 entries painted a portrait of a teenager obsessed with her appearance and the meaning of her existence. Meeting friends for tea at Schrafft's, nightclubbing at El Morocco, dancing at the Hotel Pennsylvania, the New Yorker Hotel, and the Savoy Ballroom. January 16th, 1930. I bought a pair of patent leather opera pumps with real high heels. April 20th, 1931. Dyed my eyebrows and eyelashes, and I've absolutely ruined my face. Observations about frivolous matters were interspersed with heartfelt reflections about the books she loved, Balzac and Flaubert were particular favorites. August 3rd, 1932. Spent all day reading something of Jane Austen's. How refreshing, how novel. Has her breed died out? And here I am, here we all are, sitting in this age of internet and blogs, and where our sort of daily dramas have migrated to being recorded online. And I just thought, holding this crumbling book, well, has her breed died out as I continued to read? She says, slept long hours, read the Divine Comedy, and for the most part too exhausted to think or even understand. Something I could easily relate to after just graduating from college. 4 months later, reading Hedda Gabler for the 10th time. Music, a recurring theme, scored her life with exclamation points. Beethoven symphonies, Bach fugues. June 28, 1932. Have stuffed myself with Mozart and Beethoven. I feel like a ripe apricot. I'm dizzy with the exotic. And I thought, well, I want to feel like a ripe apricot. Don't you? I think you do. You look like you do. Anyway, Florence every day was really filling herself with literature and art and music, and these were the things that she needed to survive. The young woman who emerged from the diary's pages had huge ambitions, even if chasing them proved daunting. February 21st, 1931, went to the Museum of Modern Art and almost passed out from sheer jealousy. I can't even paint an apple yet. It's heartbreaking. And I think we've all had similar experiences where we're walking around and wondering what we're going to contribute to the world. Florence here was writing about MoMA when it first opened in 1929. It was 6 rooms in the Heckscher building on the corner of 57th Street and 5th Avenue. She also spent weekdays at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when she describes it as being nearly a solitary experience and would wander through its exhibits without hardly seeing a soul. She writes here, January 16th, 1932, I couldn't study today and went to the museum to pass a morning of agonizing beauty, blown glass, jade, and exquisite embroideries. On another day, she writes, planning a play on Wordsworth, possibilities are infinite, and how I love to inflict pain on my characters. Well, as she was recording her daily dramas, she was also typing out short stories and plays on her lavender Remington typewriter with French accents. She was even working on a novel at 15. She writes, I'm working on a novel. You didn't know I was working on one, did you? But what adolescent is an adolescent without a novel? And here I am holding Florence's crumbling book, and I just thought, so true. And I found yours. Another entry, she says, wrote all day and my story is still incomplete. And I think that really crystallizes my feeling when I found Florence's diary, which was I felt that it was so magical that as a young writer, I had found this other young writer's book. And each of the entries was really written with great literary flair. And I felt that I had picked up her story where she had left off 3/4 of a century ago. What she craved most was to be enveloped in a grand passion that would transform her life. 5 hours of tennis and glorious happiness, she writes. All I want is someone to love. I feel incomplete. Well, I could certainly relate to that. At first, I thought Florence was sort of the portrait of a nice Jewish daughter growing up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She was jaunting through Central Park on horseback. She was playing the piano and tennis. At a certain point, I stumbled upon the entry, April 11th, 1932. Slept with Pearl tonight. It was beautiful. There is nothing so gratifying as physical intimacy with one you like. And I just thought, well, wow, Florence. You know, she was much more adventurous than I had initially thought. Well, over the next 3 years, I continually turned back to Florence's diary, and she became this witty, sophisticated guide that almost seemed to be leading me through the city and allowing me to see it through different eyes. And I learned about her obsession with the famous stage actress Eva Le Guillen, who was really at the forefront of American theater at the time. She was the founder of her own theater called the Civic Repertory Theater on 14th Street, and performed Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan and Hedda Gabler, thus Florence reading it 10 times, which once is really a feat as I reread it in writing this book. Florence was obsessed with this actress, not only because she was beautiful and commanding, but as Florence said, she felt that she was above the arrogance of men. And well, this was a whole different planet, really, and not to offend anybody, but this was, Florence felt that Eva Le Guillen was really the example of the independent woman that she wanted to be. And she wrote to the actress, she got no response, and went to a performance of Peter Pan one evening, and Eva Le Guillen would fly over the audience in this emerald leotard suspended by an invisible fishing wire. It must have really been some sensation sitting in the audience. Sorry we can't reproduce it tonight. But after the performance, Florence went up to an usher and she handed her this portrait she had drawn of Eva Le Guillen, and she said, "Give this to Miss Le Guillen, tell her I want to see her." Now, before I tell you what happens, I just have to describe Florence briefly. She's 15 at this point. Her mother, who started as a seamstress on the Lower East Side, eventually became a couture dressmaker on Madison Avenue. So she was always outfitted in these beautiful clothes, such as a velvet coat with a silver fox collar, or dresses, which I learned a whole new term for, which was making a sensation in. She had snuck a bottle of peroxide from her father's medical office, which was in their apartment, and had dyed her hair platinum blonde. And so the usher comes back and she says, "Follow me," and Florence is brought backstage to Eva Le Guillen's dressing room, and the actress is sitting there to her vanity with her powder puffs and rouges around her, and Florence sort of breathlessly says, "Thank you so much for seeing me. I love you." And Eva Le Guillen laughs and she says, "But my dear, you're a baby." And she invited her to join her acting troupe, which was very prestigious, actually. Katharine Hepburn had been turned down from it. And she went home, and Florence's father absolutely blew up at her. The thought of his daughter, not continuing her education, her college education, was, unheard of. So that was just a cameo and one entry in the 2000. And each one was equally adventurous or self-reflective. In the summer, I followed Florence on her trips to the Catskills, where at 13, she first met one of 8 beautiful brothers who she described as being built like Greek gods, who worked their family's farm, which was a small retreat called Spring Lake. This sort of also opened up this whole culture of the Catskills to me, even through their family. It was sort of like a dirty dancing of the 1930s. The 8 beautiful brothers, in fact, serviced, I later learned, many of the wives who were staying there with their kids while their husbands were in the city at work. And the oldest of the 8 godly brothers was a man named Meyer Horowitz. Well, when his sister, Frances, died in the 1918 influenza epidemic, Meyer ended up taking Frances's name and changing his last name Horowitz to Howitt, and became Francis M. Howitt, which was a business decision at a time when New York and the rest of the country was really still very bigoted. And he opened up a hotel called South Wind, and it became very popular among the sort of young intelligentsia of the time. It wasn't kosher, there were no kids allowed, and it actually makes an appearance in the book Marjorie Morningstar by Herman Wouk. And I mention this because Florence has actually been compared to Marjorie Morningstar before Herman Wouk graduated from college, sort of the real thing, by the New York Times Book Review. Well, I had the diary for 3 years. And as I said, I really felt a deep connection with Florence. In fact, I felt like we could have almost been the same person, though, she was living in this sort of sepia world where she was riding the top deck of the double-decker Fifth Avenue bus and staring into these lavish apartments, and each light post was decorated by a statue of Mercury, and I was, in my internet age and searching for a connection everywhere and not quite finding one until I picked up the diary. Well, at the New York Times, I had moved away from celebrity reporting, and I was now covering what I thought of as vestiges of an older New York, as our whole country really fills up with Starbuckses and Citibanks and many of those characters that really make, in particular, New York such an interesting place, become, in my mind, sort of an endangered species. And I wrote about, for example, an 83-year-old Sumi Ink teacher who teaches Japanese brush painting in this dusty storefront nestled between the designer boutiques of Soho. I covered the Proust Society and the Finnegan's Wake Society. One story I was particularly proud of was about Manhattan's last typewriter repairman. And he worked in the Flatiron Building in this crammed office filled with his blackened machines. And like when I found the diary, I found myself traveling back in time. I pushed through his frosted glass door, stenciled room 807. In fact, his father had started the business in 1932, which was an interesting overlap with the years of the diary. Well, the day this story ran, I received a phone call out of the blue from a private investigator, someone who I've never received a phone call before, a profession that I haven't had much experience with. Anyway, he said he was a lover of old New York, like myself, and that this story had really touched a chord in him. And he said he was very old school and could we meet for lunch? Well, he picked the place, and it was Keen's Steakhouse in Midtown, which was, has been there since, I think, 1885, and these old clay smoking pipes decorate the ceiling. And this was this blustery March day in 2006, and Charlie is his name. He pulls up, and his license plate is Sleuth 3, and he's wearing a trench coat. And as we started looking at the menu, he actually pulled a magnifying glass out of his inside pocket. And I said, "Are you for real?" And he laughed, and he said he was. This was really more for middle-aged private eyes who'd forgotten their eyeglasses at home. Well, I pulled out the diary out of my bag, and I told him the story that I've just shared with you, and he became absolutely transfixed with Florence. He thought that she was a femme fatale, and he turned to me and he said, "Lily, wouldn't it be incredible if we could find her heirs?" Well, I had actually been on a personal quest to find Florence. I had ripped out the Wolfson pages out of the phone book to no avail. I mean, there were about, 10 pages or so. I checked with the research department at the time. That had been a dead end. And over the next few weeks, by searching New York City's birth records and using this collection of vintage telephone books that he has that goes back to the early 20th century, he has about 1,000, if you can imagine, all stored in Tupperware in his Long Island home. I've met his wife. She's, very patient, nice lady. He found 3 Florence Wolfsons who were born in 1915. And we knew this was the year she was born because the diary had been a gift for her 14th birthday. Well, 2 of the Florences were no longer alive. One still was. It was noted that her father was a doctor. The only other clue I had to Florence's identity, besides the inscription in the frontispiece, was this old clipping from the newspaper that was written in Yiddish and in English that said that Florence Wolfson had won this college scholarship, the Regents, at 15, and that she lived in 1391 Madison Avenue. Well, by triangulating this information and using old voter registration records, Charlie eventually led me to Florence Howitt, a 90-year-old woman living with her husband of 67 years in Westport. And this was the first moment I sort of gave pause, and I thought, well, have I gone a little too far in my voyeuristic glimpse into this young woman's world? I really felt like I knew Florence. In fact, the diary almost seemed like my diary. It was on my bedside table by now, and all of these names that were sprinkled through its pages, like, Nat and Manny and George and Pearl and a mysterious woman named M, all people whose hearts Florence had chipped, if not broken. I felt that I knew them as well. Well, I call up Florence, and she answers, and she has a voice of what seems to me like a stage actress, and she was absolutely stunned. She had completely forgotten about the existence of the diary, but as I started describing it to her, it started coming back, and she just said to me, who are you that you've searched me out of the universe? And she said, I have to meet you. And of course, I had to meet her too. So I went to Grand Central, as I did today, and it really felt like the perfect stage set for this next leg of the journey, going under the constellation painted ceiling and past the old information booth, which at Florence's time you could actually ask any question of, regardless of train timetables, and they would answer you. It almost seems genie-like to me. And I take the train, and Florence's daughter, Valerie, picks me up at the station and takes me along these winding roads to Florence's house. And she lives on Long Island Sound over this one-lane wooden bridge, Saugatuck Island, if you know it. And I go in, and Florence is really unexpectedly glamorous. She's sitting in her leather Eames chair by the garden and wearing these little tortoise-shell Christian Dior glasses. And she held out her arms to me, and she hugged me, and I handed her the diary. And it was really an incredible moment, which she writes about in the foreword to the book, which is just, what does it feel like when a forgotten chunk of your life is handed back to you? And she said, it stopped my heart for a moment. And Florence was there paging through these worn leaves, and she really began telling me her story. Although I'd had these 2,000 entries, and I think it really speaks to the power of the word that I was able to glean so much from reading them about her life, it was a 5-year diary. So each page, it was a popular kind at the time, was separated into spaces for 5 years, only 4 lines per day. And so there were many questions I had for Florence. Like, first of all, her parents. When I first found the diary, I had no idea this was a 14 to 19-year-old girl. It seemed more like a Sex in the City of the 30s. Florence was really coming and going from her parents' Upper East Side apartment as she pleased, going to the theater and to the symphony and to opera. And so Florence told me about her parents, who were both immigrants who had come to the country in 1906. Her mother was a twin whose family actually didn't have the money to send both sisters over. And after she arrived in America alone at 16, expecting her sister to follow, her sister was actually killed in a pogrom along with the rest of the family. And so Rebecca was on her own. But very unusual for the time. She was a business owner. Florence was born in the Bronx. Then Rebecca started her business when Florence was growing up with her younger brother and her father in this brownstone on West 113th Street. Then Florence went to school at Wadley, which was the first all-women's public high school in New York. The girls were known as the Owlettes, after their mascot, Minerva. And their ranks included the prolific diarist Anais Nin and Lillian Hellman and Jean Stapleton. Then, Florence wanted to go to Barnard, but sort of had this misstep at her entrance interview, which is that she showed up in a suit and tie a la Eva Le Gallienne. Well, Barnard's assured me she would have gotten in today. In fact, their whole incoming class read the book over the summer. But Florence ended up at Hunter, which was actually worked better with her parents' pocketbook since it was the Depression. And there she was the editor-in-chief of their literary journal called Echo, which was very prestigious at the time. And on her staff was a young woman named Belle Kaufman, who would later become the best-selling author of Up the Down Staircase, as well as Joy Davidman, who would later marry C.S. Lewis, their marriage chronicled in the movie Shadowlands. Then after Hunter, it was off to Columbia for Florence. She was one of only a handful of female graduate students at the time studying English, and she set about doing something very unusual, which was to start a literary salon in her parents' apartment. She writes many times about reading Gertrude Stein in the diary, and I asked her if this was modeled on Gertrude Stein's salon. She said no, it was, her own. But she served white wine, and she invited her guests to come to her house, and she remembered bending down to light the fireplace. And as she did, she would unpin her long blonde hair and let it cascade down her shoulders as her members debated the poetics of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And Florence turned to me and she said, "Does anybody read philosophy anymore? Do they talk about it?" I said, "Florence, I think you'll inspire them too." Well, part of this whole group of her salon, it was this whole Depression-era stamped group of children, the sons and daughters of immigrants mostly, who were trying to carve out an artistic life for themselves, almost like precursors to the children of the 60s. But Delmore Schwartz, the preeminent poet of his generation after T.S. Eliot, was part of this circle, as was John Berryman, who would later win the Pulitzer Prize for his work Dream Songs. Are any of you familiar with Delmore Schwartz? Well, it's strange that he's been sort of overlooked in literary history, but he's really worth looking back at. And he was a young man who became famous for this one short story and then went on to write many other works. And it was called In Dreams Begin Responsibilities. And it's sort of autobiographical, and it's him sitting in this old movie theater, and he's watching this splotchy black and white film of his parents on their first date. They're at Coney Island, and they're walking along, and they pass a fortune teller, and they get their photograph taken. And at just the moment his father's about to propose to his mother, Delmore stands up in the theater and he says, "Don't do it." He says, "Nothing will come of it but two remorseful children." And as always happens in New York, a woman stands up next to me and she says, "Shut up, you're ruining the movie, sit down." And he does, and the poet wakes up from his dream. Well, Florence brought out these old photographs, and one was this picture of this dashing young man in a white aviator's jacket about to climb into his propeller plane, and she pronounced all 5 of his names. He was an Italian count, Filippo Canaletti Gaudente da Cirolo. All of Florence's friends were in a race to get to Europe because as artists they felt that it was a beacon they wanted to be a part of, and Florence traveled from London to Paris to Rome, where she embarked on this love affair with Filippo, who was a poet and a pilot and composed love verses to her. And I sort of turned to Florence and I said, "This is becoming Titanic." And we laughed. But there was a bittersweet moment to the reunion with Florence, which is she turned to me and she said, "From reading about this young woman in the diary's pages, how did I end up living this ordinary life?" And she felt that she hadn't lived up to many of her early aspirations. She hadn't written the great American novel. Well, she had had a career in the 40s writing all sorts of feminist-tinged articles for the big women's magazines at the time, like Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal, which at the time published really serious fiction like Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis. And the titles are really revealing of Florence's own place in her life at that time, like What to Do with the Unmarried Daughter, or How to Behave in Public Without an Escort, which is hard for me to imagine, or How to Quarrel with Your Husband After She Was Recently Married. Well, as Florence put it, her parents had been sending her to the Catskills since she was about 13 to find a nice doctor, who to sew up her life basically as soon as possible. Well, she ended up on the eve of her 24th birthday, which she felt was quite old, in fact, marrying one of the 8 beautiful brothers, the Greek gods, one named Nat Howitt, who was a dentist. Her mother was not thrilled because he wasn't a doctor, but they eloped and they drove to Mexico for their honeymoon. And although Florence continued to write after they got married and was a director for a time, taking on this almost Eva Le Guillian-like stint directing plays, she found herself drifting further away from writing as she had two lovely daughters and now has grandchildren and great-grandchildren, great-grandchildren, yeah. And got into the stock market, in fact, and today said she would have been, called herself an investor probably if she was a man, though she's, really been sort of not so excited about what the markets have been doing recently, and watching them very closely. Florence, who is still very matter-of-fact today, turned to me and she said, have I been a disappointment to you? And I said, not at all. And she really hadn't. And that's really the significance and really the beauty of this book, which is that I could have never imagined that I would have met this 90-year-old who, sitting across from me, still seemed like that intense, vibrant woman of the diary and has a very active internal life and just was willing to allow a stranger into her life and to really open up her book to her and her world. And I really felt that I had brought this young woman of the diary's pages to meet her 90-year-old version. And although it took the two a few beats to recognize each other, they did. And Florence just turned to me and she said, "You've brought back my life." And I told her, "You've brought back mine as well." And it was just so serendipitous that this became the portal into me writing my first book, and that this has really allowed Florence to have this incredible second act in her 90s. And the story's really continued beyond the covers of the Red Leather Diary, which is we've been on this incredible journey together. We were on the Today Show in Good Morning America. Florence has had a very busy summer of doing all sorts of interviews. She said, God, people, care about what I think, They want to hear my thoughts on Palin, on the election, on, the markets, just on what it's like to be 90. And people, whenever she speaks with me, people say, we're the road show together. We really are. We have this wonderful rapport. And I always felt that the diary was a work of art when I found it. And Florence's words, these words she never expected anybody to find, that were written in this book as a starry-eyed 16-year-old and hidden behind this tiny lock and key, have really come to rewrite her life later. And she turned to me and she said, "Lily, my life was a tragedy before you came along." I said, "Oh, come on, Florence." Because now she's got like a grandmother best friend. She said, "Yeah, but now it's a romantic comedy." And that's certainly true. And she has dibs on Meryl Streep to play her in the movie version. And, I think Scarlett Johansson would make a wonderful younger Florence. And I'm just going to pause there and see if you have any questions. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience.
That was very interesting times there. Were there any entries that were about the times rather than herself? And did she realize what she was going through or what was happening?
Yeah, she wrote about this stock market crash, actually. And both of her parents lost all of their money. They were invested in the stock market. Though her mother, because of this dress business that she had, and she was really catering to many women who were unaffected by the Depression, she was able to keep the family afloat. And Florence remembered seeing the shanty towns in Central Park and, passing men selling apples and pencils on the street. At Columbia, one of her mentors was Mark Van Doren, and they organized a protest together, a huge protest that thousands of students came to, that Florence really led against sending troops to Europe, at the beginning of World War II. And when she went to Europe, the Spanish Civil War was just starting. She obviously didn't travel to Spain, and there was this interesting moment where she was on a boat going from England to France, and she meets two German boys, and they insist on her coming back to Bavaria with them. And her parents had told her not to go to Germany, and they told her, you're the perfect example of an Aryan woman, and Florence just said she was, sort of too nervous to say anything, and smiled in a very uncomfortable sort of humorous picture now looking back on it that's included in the book. But so a diary by its very nature is sort of very teenage-like. I mean, the world is always revolving around you, but it's certainly a social history as well. I mean, this book is really, I think, an example of how a very detailed chronicle can be epic in scope.
Thank you.
Yes?
Did you return the diary to her?
I did. No, I returned it to Florence. And long before this was ever a book, I mean, all I really wanted to do was return this diary to Florence and to meet her. She was almost like this literary heroine to me, and I had to meet the real person, and I wasn't disappointed in the least. And I think I learned a lot about just the compromises one makes in life, but I think Florence has really proved that it's never too late to reclaim a lost part of yourself. And in fact, as soon as she found out that I write for the New York Times, she said, "Oh, this is an incredible story," and actually loved being photographed. She really comes to life under the camera. And so it grew into a cover story for the New York Times, which was called Speak Memory, which I always thought was a really appropriate title, because then when it became a book, Florence first, when she heard the idea of a book, she thought I was joking. She said, "But I'm not a celebrity, I'm not a public figure, is this a material of memoir?" And I assured her that it was. And she's really seen that come into fruition. But I spent about a whole summer visiting her every Sunday as we got to know each other. We both reread the diary, and we would just have conversations about her life as I let the tape recorder, record things. And then it was really my job to tell the story behind the diary and to weave all of this material together. And it's an amalgam of memoir and biography, of finding the diary, part detective story of finding Florence, her at 90 reflecting on the course of her life, who she set out to become and who she ended up becoming. But ultimately really using the diary as a portal to recreate her 1930s world. And as a writer in a profession that can often be very solitary, I found myself really just trying to show how magical this was really, just to be able to see the world through somebody else's eyes. And the diary was my script, and I was running around New York in my tangerine coat that I had found in the dumpster, and visiting each place that had figured into Florence's diary and getting in touch with anybody who was still alive in its pages. In fact, nobody was, except for her friend Belle Kaufman, though I got in touch with everybody else's relatives and interviewed them. Belle Kaufman is now 97. She only wears high heels. The first time I met her, she recited the whole love song of J.F. and Prufrock to me. Like Florence, and something my generation has certainly lost, is this ability to recite poetry. And Florence oftentimes would recite, whole parts of Tintern Abbey to me, or other poems that really moved her.
Did her family realize what a rich life she had lived?
Well, her daughters were both there when I returned the diary to Florence, and just sort of hovering and waiting to hear what they would find out. And after they finished the book, which they were both very supportive of, they just told me they had learned so much about their mother from reading it, and not only the risque parts, but just being able to see her as this young, passionate woman searching for love and meaning. And in fact, this has led me to my next book, which I'm writing right now, which is exploring the very nature of how we know our parents, and specifically our mothers. I mean, it's sometimes hard to think of their young adulthood even existing after we came into the picture. And I think that's why this title is also quite unusual. People have really connected with it as a portal into their own lives, into their mother's lives, into their parents' lives, into their own lives. Well,
I just had to come tonight to hear you because I read your book. It was fascinating, and it opened up a whole new world to me that I had no idea existed. And I lived very close to New York, and so in growing up and as a child and a teenager and a young adult, was in the city most of the time. But it was just a fascinating new world, and the book was absolutely delightful.
thank you so much. I'm so glad you came to become part of it even closer. There's another question here.
Lily, that was absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure what I want to ask you, maybe just ask for your comments. I have my grandmother's diaries, red leather diaries, from the first one in 1891 when she was 6, and she just wrote a little tiny bit.
Mm-hmm.
Then she skipped till she was 14 in 1899 and continued until about 1970 daily. And I have them all, and I've always thought of a book somehow. I've not done anything with them except transcribe them. I have them all typed. Of course, they're fascinating.
Right.
She doesn't go a great deal into world affairs, world things, but the portraits of, especially around 1900 as a teenager, dancing the cakewalk, and, it's wonderful,
Right.
and then all her kids and everything, but
Well, I think we should all petition the government to, create some sort of Library of Congress of diaries. Take notes, librarians. Wouldn't it be fascinating? Diaries they're so rich. Of course, they're in many archives, but imagine if you were moving into a new house and you could check out the diary of someone who had lived there, 50 years ago. Well, that actually happened with me because Florence and I had both lived in that same building, 98 Riverside Drive, where she raised her family. But I would just say that they're really treasures, and it's a good thing that you know that they are, because some people come to my readings with their diaries in tow. Other people have raised their hands and said, I have a red leather diary, and now I think I'm going to burn it.
The Library of Congress does have a program like that. It's for veterans, and they're interviewed and taped and put away as a record of what the veteran, his description of what happened when he was in the war. So there is an
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I think I'm just probing to say, and I think the real stories of importance are those of ordinary lives, and we all know the expression that everybody has a novel in them. And I felt that this book was so important to write because it was really about the significance of all of our lives. And here was this little diary which is literally headed for a landfill, which was given a second life. So take what you will from that. And I think I'll answer any other question afterward. You have one burning question.
Was that orange coat Florence's, or was it from another trunk?
It was from another trunk, but Florence has since slipped into it and looks wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.